Well, good morning. Welcome to the Augustine Society lecture series. We are delighted, and it's an awesome opportunity to have Dr. Adam Sutton. He's the director of Aurelius Archaeology. He's got 15 years of expertise in Roman and Iron Age Britain, and specifically in the ceramics of the time period there. Equally interesting is that Doc is an archaeologist and a ceramics expert, and looking at the pottery and the potters in Roman Britain's Upper Nene Valley, in that early period of Roman settlement and conquest in Romano Britain. Uh, what is interesting is you're to be in the room with Doc. He is extremely enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and engaging, and he welcomes the new learner and the expert in a way. This is not in what he wrote us. I'm just speaking from experience. I think that you will find that his presentation is going to be really interesting as he talks about these humble fragments, that shards that we find on insights, and shows us the skills and identities and the lives of the people who we have their work. We don't necessarily know who they are a lot of times. He has over a decade led UK pottery projects. He is also a member of a pioneering research on late Iron Age ceramic technology, 5 years on the committee for the study group of Roman pottery. Um, he's led the analysis of the A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon Road improvement scheme, one of UK's largest ever archaeological programs. As I noted, he's passionate about exploring material culture. He is amazing in helping us understand the past, and the ancient people that worked on the objects we find, and how those are used in their daily lives, and how their identities are reflected in the grave objects buried with them. Uh, Met him at Airchester, at the Chester House and the Ark, and I will just again reiterate how impressive it was watching Adam deal with a whole layer of expertise in a way that was engaging, meaningful, and respectful. So with that, Doc, the fanboying is done, and we'll turn the screen over to you.
Thank you, Rod. Much appreciated. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Yep, good. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so firstly, thanks everybody for coming. This is a real pleasure to be able to talk to you guys, and particularly thank you for coming, given that it's relatively early over there. Um, Hopefully, you've had your morning coffee and are ready for some archaeological content. So, yeah. Um, Basically, yeah, as Rod says, the emphasis that I've got for this talk is on a specific geographical region, which is sort of underserved in the way that we understand Roman Britain. I'll go into why that might be in a few minutes. But what I'm really looking at getting out of this is not kind of a dry sort of account of, they were making this sort of pottery and it was moving from here to there and that sort of stuff, and this is what it looks like, but a appreciation of the people who were behind that material culture. So I'm going to be focusing this talk on presenting the evidence, which I've been gathering over the course of the last few years now, working in this area through several research projects, looking at how this can all help us understand who these people were, basically, and to appreciate their skills and to look at their position kind of socioeconomically and within the Roman economy. Um, so I think the first thing that I want to do, really want to emphasize, is that crafts and the study archaeologically of technology is an incredibly potent way of looking at the past. We tend in Roman studies at least to think about craftspeople through things like their funerary monuments, the funerary inscriptions from predominantly the Mediterranean area, which show these people at work. But actually, archaeology, in my mind, tells us more because we have the objects themselves. And ceramics are uniquely positioned for this. Ceramics are a plastic medium, that is, they are made from clay, which is formed into shape. And by looking at the evidence that is preserved in the clay itself, as it is now fired, can often reveal quite interesting and intricate traces of the ways in which the ceramics were made. So, for instance, Hopefully you can see my cursor here. So this image here, the black and white one, is an X-ray of a pot from one of the sites in the Upper Nene Valley, which I've been working on. And you can see it's got these kind of dark patches which seem to be all going in a diagonal direction. There's evidence of wheel throwing because you've got a soft lump of clay, turning it on the wheel. You've got a horizontal force as the wheel turns, and then the potter's fingers provide a vertical force, and in aggregate, things tend to line up diagonally. So there's little air pockets that have kind of stretched during that motion. So already we've got something which is, a really kind of intricate, intimate detail of an action which someone committed, best part of 2,000 years ago. As well as that, on the ground, you've got evidence in the form of actual industrial features. So this image here is the remains of a Roman period pottery kiln, first century date, probably built by people from within probably the first generation of occupants of Roman Britain. Um, this is, so you can see it's kind of a round shape. That's the firing chamber where the pottery would have been stacked up, ready to be fired. And a lot of material has been dumped back into that feature. Probably at the end of its use, you got bits of the superstructure has collapsed and that sort of thing. So by unpicking what was in that feature, we can start looking at, right, how was this material fired? And what were those materials made of and so on. As well as that, you've got things like the traditional study of pottery fabrics. This is a thin section photomicrograph, i.e. a very small image, a kind of microscopic image of a ceramic fabric. And you can see in this case, we've got evidence for the combination of raw materials in the form of the raw clay itself and various grains of temper, that is, additives to the clay, which serve various purposes in terms of improving its working properties. In this case, that is flint that we've got there, so it's been crushed up and thrown in as an additive. By combining all of those sort of sources of evidence, we can get a really, really nuanced picture of how ceramic technology worked at a given point in the past. And so it's through those means that hopefully I will succeed in convincing you that we've got lots and lots of evidence for past craft working processes, which allow us then to consider the lives of the people who were involved in these processes. A little bit of geographic scene setting, because I'm aware that some of you guys are familiar with the territory that I'm talking about, but for those of you who aren't, we are talking about the Upper Nene Valley region. Now, the Nene Valley, well, the River Nene is a major river in England, central England, which flows from west to east through the English Midlands. Um, the image that I've taken here was actually taken not far from the site at Irchester, which Rod's already mentioned, where the river flows past the Roman settlement there. You can see, green and pleasant land, all that sort of stuff. It's a really quite sort of quaint area of the world for the most part. You've got lots of kind of cute little villages and that sort of thing. The river itself is currently navigable, but probably was not navigable during the Roman period, based on what we know about its navigability during the medieval period and previously. Um, but it's a major landscape feature and it flows through the area of Northamptonshire, which is the county marked in red on the map here. Northamptonshire is sort of a little bit out of the way of some of the major settlements of nowadays, and that was the same in the Roman period. So, on the map that we've got here, I've shown the locations of some of the major settlements of Roman Britain. You've got places like London, which was obviously a Roman foundation, as well as places like St Albans, Leicester, Lincoln, all of which has their origins kind of in the immediate Roman period, if not just slightly beforehand. But Northamptonshire sits quite prettily between these areas, so it's predominantly a rural area in this period, with not really any major urban settlements. Um, but that's not to say that we don't have archaeology of this period in Northamptonshire. There's actually an abundance of it. So this is a map that's a little bit out of date. It's I think it's about 20 years old now, but it serves the point that each of those little kind of circular dots is evidence of a Roman settlement in Northamptonshire. So you can see there's hundreds of them. There's even more now. There are various Roman roads crisscrossing the region, predominantly leading to some of the major towns that I was pointing out on the previous map. But no major towns within the region itself. But there are what we call nucleated settlements or small towns, which is a bit of an ambiguous term. But effectively, what we're talking about there are sort of, medium to large villages. Effectively, you're talking, a community of potentially a few hundred people, maybe into the sort of low thousands in some of the larger ones, which still retained a bit of an agricultural character. They're not sort of urban in the way that you might think of Roman urbanism, certainly not in the sort of Mediterranean sense. We're not talking about massive amounts of public buildings, although there were temples and things like that provided for these settlements, also mancios and bathhouses and things like that. Um, On the subject of small towns, this is actually the walled area of the Roman town Irchester, which Rod has already mentioned, taken during a particularly dry summer during the 1970s, where you can see the street pattern. And again, you can see it's not one of those gridded street patterns that we think of as typical for a Roman settlement. It's kind of an organic emergence, it looks like, that it sort of developed, yeah, fairly organically. Um, and yeah, as well as that, we've got various pieces of evidence, including villas, several major villas, for instance, at Piddington and Stanwick, um, which have been really extensively excavated and which kind of colour that impression of a predominantly rural character to the region. These are effectively big country houses. And there's also evidence for industry in terms of ironworking and iron extraction, which was predominantly in the northeastern part of the county up here, near sort of Ashton, Laxton, those sorts of places. And that was probably a major feature of the economy of that area. But the area that we're going to be talking about today predominantly is in this sort of central region where the River Nene comes past the Roman towns of Duston, Irchester, and this sort of area. So yeah, I'll kind of go into a bit more detail about settlement pattern as I'm going through the talk. So just bear that in mind. Um, in terms of ceramic production, so in Roman Britain, we have this kind of idea of there being numerous large industries which produced ceramics and went on to supply a lot of the province with their pottery of various types. For instance, among these, you've got the Oxfordshire potteries, the Lower Nene Valley potteries, and the Black Burnish ware producers down in Dorset, which produce an awful lot of volume. Um, Pottery production in Roman Britain seems to have been therefore fairly sort of industrialized in a sense, not in the sense of factories producing this stuff, but in terms of large volumes of material being produced by kind of nucleated clusters of people. And you can see some of these producers, for the Dorset Black Burnish Red producers, for instance, you've got a tight little cluster of sites making that stuff, and there's the same around the New Forest, Oxfordshire, etc. Um, Ours doesn't quite look like that. What we've got actually is, despite the fact that this is a relatively understudied industry, the Upper Nene Valley industry has got one of the most extensive clusters of pottery kiln finds. Or I should have mentioned each of these dots is a Roman pottery kiln from the website romankilns.net, which is a website that exists for some reason. No, it's actually really useful for us as specialists. But so what we're looking at here is actually a really understudied but very extensive body of evidence, um, which if you're looking at this map overall, you'd say actually that's kind of a major center of pottery production here, but it's one that we really don't understand that much about, which is why I've been doing this work on it recently. Um, so yeah, to zoom in a little bit more, my interest in this industry started in about 2018 when I kind of started working in this region and realized, oh, there's not really anything about this, despite the fact that it shows up so prominently on some of our distribution maps and in the literature. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at it in a bit more depth. The work I'm predominantly presenting on here today was funded by the study group for Roman pottery, who allowed me to do a literature review of this industry just to sort of tease out a lot of that detail and draw together the evidence into a synthetic form. And this um, effectively. came up with evidence for around 100 pottery kilns, which is a huge number. Um, these derived from more than 40 known settlements, um, predominantly dating to the mid first and mid third centuries AD. So it's a decent span of time, but there's definitely an emphasis in the mid first to sort of mid second centuries AD. So that kind of very early Roman period, when things are just sort of getting going in terms of what we realize as recognizably Roman in terms of ceramic production. I won't go into detail on the pottery types because I don't want to bore you guys to sleep, but the what to take away from this really is that they're producing an awful lot of variety. I'll go into some detail about some of those types where they're interesting, but the point I want you to take away from this is that these are highly skilled and diverse people. They've got an awful lot of different skills, ranging from coursewares, which may have been hand built for the most part, and therefore kind of fairly low skill, maybe a lower level of production, closer to home in terms of maybe being made at home, through to fine wares made through all sorts of different means, and with really refined clays, lots of skill in terms of the throwing of the vessels. There's an awful lot to unpack in that. But the emphasis I want you to take away is that they are diverse and very highly skilled in a lot of cases. What's the actual evidence that we have on the ground for Roman kilns? Well, I've already discussed this example of a Roman kiln found sort of collapsed in on itself, which was excavated at Brackmills, just south of the modern town of Northampton. Effectively, a Roman kiln can be summarized as an updraft type. That is I'll go on to the next slide briefly. So this probably illustrates the point best as possible. So looking at it from the side on, you effectively have a pit that is dug subterraneously, over which a superstructure made of turf, clay, or various other different sort of perishable substances will have been raised. Um, within that structure, you have a elevated floor, which allows for when a fire is set in this part of the pit, which is what's called the stoke hole, or in what we call the flue or firebox. The flames and the kind of hot gases that are there produced will be able to be conducted up into a wear chamber, which is contained within that elevated structure. That's where your pots are. Effectively, you will get temperatures of around 800 to 1,000 degrees centigrade within that firing chamber. And then you also have various vents to kind of let out those gases, and which can be plugged in various different ways to achieve different colors. So, for instance, if you're trying to produce a grey or a black pottery, you will plug all of those vents and allow the kind of hot gases to circulate within themselves, depriving the atmosphere of oxygen and therefore creating a black or grey color. So, yeah, but we are basically left mostly with remains that look kind of like this, although sometimes we're also faced with the evidence of portable kiln furniture. That is objects like this. This is what we call a kiln bar. And now in some arrangements, you get kiln bars used to create that temporary floor, which is elevating the ceramics off the ground. And so you can see in this arrangement, the bars are kind of wedged within the wall of the kiln to create that raised floor. So they're a portable object. So that when we find these, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got a pottery kiln right there, but it probably means you've got some nearby. Um, right. So after those sort of basics, who were the Upper Nene Valley potters? That's kind of the question that I'm going to hinge the rest of the talk around. And it's a question to which there is no straight answer, but it is a question to which we've got lots and lots of different sources of evidence. Thinking just hypothetically about who, the kind of identities that they might have adhered to. Perhaps they were soldiers. It's a quite an old argument, but one that people still make fairly forcefully sometimes, that um, potters might have come over with the Roman army, bringing lots of skills and different experiences with them, and settled down to supply soldiers and then kind of distributed their skills to the civilian population. It's one possibility. Were they entrepreneurs? Potentially within that model, the Roman army might have needed supplying, and so potentially local people could have been prompted to supply that need and thereby develop skills in that way. Were they itinerant craftspeople? That is people who were moving around to sort of follow different markets, potentially different legions, or to move between different settlements and cater to people there. That's again one argument that's quite forcefully advanced sometimes. Were they on kind of the other end of the spectrum of sophistication, as it were? Were they just farmers making things for kind of additional economic gain? Um, so let's have a look at what the evidence says about that. So one of the things that I've done for this project is a bit of a mapping study. So kind of looking at where those kilns are occurring in the landscape. So to return to Mon and Rod's site at Irchester, this is the part of the Nene Valley. So you can see that this is the River Nene flowing past the site. And just to put it into perspective, the picture that I took earlier was taken about there. So it's kind of right dead center in the middle of the Nene Valley. Chester is a walled town, that is, it's defended. So this darker red square is a defended area, but we actually have geophysical evidence of a much more sprawling settlement over the extent of the kind of raised terraces above the floodplain of the river. And you can see that, while we've got some kilns in the area, there's not like loads. It's not as if people are moving towards Chester as a market. If you were thinking of that kind of itinerant model, for instance, you potentially expect, there's probably a couple of thousand people living at Chester throughout the Roman period. Um, you'd expect people to sort of gravitate towards a town like that. But that's not what we see. We've got a single kiln excavated at Chester in 1962 in the kind of suburbs of the town. That's the only confirmed example that we've got. There's the argument that another feature exists underneath what is currently the Chester House estate. So kind of there, just north of the 1962 example. But it's not confirmed, so I've not included that one on here. But in any case, two for a suburban area, it's not loads. You've also got one about a kilometre away at Little Chester, and you've got the set of six at Rushton, a bit further away to the east. Now, that's not, it doesn't look like really people are being kind of gravitated towards this settlement. Certainly not enough kilns are here to supply the population with all of their needs um, for really any period of time. So I don't think we've got evidence for people kind of using this as an economic opportunity, um, which is interesting. It takes off the table a couple of those options already. Looking at another probably fairly major settlement, although a bit less well understood in this period, you've got the Roman town of Kettering. That is in the sort of northern part of the county. And we don't really understand too much about Roman Kettering. We know roughly its extent. And again, that's the kind of the red area that I've mapped on there, which we understand through kind of various surveys and kind of keyhole excavations. It's a bit annoying because this is a town on which the Roman town has subsequently been built. So really the only excavations we get are kind of keyholes, little snapshots, which allow us to tell whether there's Roman evidence there. Um, so we've got a few kiln sites in the region. Again, you've got a smattering, one down here, one down there. You've got 14 at Weekly, which is one of the biggest clusters in the region, but it's a little bit far away and it's also fairly short-lived. So the settlement at Weekly was probably in operation between the sort of 8040s to 70s. So really quite early on in the Roman period. The Roman invasion occurred in about 8043. So early on in the period, and also if you take then that out of the equation, in that whole post AD 70 period, you don't really have much evidence for any pottery production at all. So again, it's not like people are being gravitated towards this area. We do have stray finds related to pottery production, though, at these four sites. They're mostly stray bits of kiln bar, again, that could have been moving around with people as they moved themselves. Perhaps the most enigmatic find is from I think it's from the Walnut Crescent site here, just south of the town itself. And it's a relief mold for decorating pottery. So you can imagine what you do with this. It's a little object kind of about this big. Um, you would have a bit of clay that's kind of pressed into the mold and then pressed onto a ceramic and lifted away to leave the image of this ball player. Um, it's interesting for several reasons. I won't go into the sporting analogies or the potential sort of religious analogies, but the point is that if that is the case, this is a really unusual find for a Roman pottery production site. We don't really have any of these from any of the other Roman production sites in Britain. So the hint is that there's something potentially going on at Kettering in terms of pottery production, based on those finds of stray bits of kiln furniture alongside this, but we don't really know too much about it. But again, the message to take away from this, I think, at this stage, is that we don't really have any evidence for people gravitating towards this settlement as a major focus for sort of marketing or anything like that. Where we do see the gravitation of kiln sites is actually in rural settlements, where we've excavated large tracts of rural settlements. This is a plan of the settlement of Bosiet North, which is just a couple of kilometres south of the town of Irchester. Um, Basically, it might be a little bit hard to see because of the way that the plans are drawn out, but effectively, these blue features are pits and ditches associated with paddocks and agricultural enclosures. There's not really any direct settlement evidence at Bosiet, as far as I'm aware. There's no kind of houses or major structures. So probably what we're looking at is the outlying area of a farm. And within that outlying area, you've got a dense cluster of 12 kilns, these red features down in this corner of this one enclosure. Now, the fact that those are there, kind of evidently situated away from contemporary occupation, but within the kind of confines of a of an agricultural settlement, to me suggests that you've got people who are working nearby, potentially with fairly minimal investment in pottery production, but they're kind of putting that within the context of the wider sphere of agriculture. And there's the same perception at Weekly, that's that site near Kettering that I've just mentioned. You've got a bit of settlement evidence here. You can see that there's a hut there, what we'd now call a roundhouse, um, excavated right next to one of these kilns. And there's another one over here and another one over here in a separate excavation area. So there's contemporary settlement evidence in this case. But again, most of the kilns are kind of dotted around enclosure systems. So again, kind of away from any of the major structural evidence, which makes sense given the kind of noxious fumes and smoke that would have been produced by the kilns. But within the context of a wider agricultural settlement, there is a suggestion of a Roman villa at Weekly. So again, that kind of anchors us in that perception that this is a predominantly rural phenomenon rather than something that's accreted to the development of sort of nucleated urban settlements during this period. To again sort of round that home, this is my distribution map again of the kilns and kiln furniture find spots across the region. And what I want you to focus on there is this dense cluster of find spots of kiln furniture, but which doesn't really have any evidence of kilns directly in it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that that area was fairly intensively field walked during the 1950s and 60s. So you've got people, I don't know if you guys do field walking in the States, but people going along the landscape and kind of systematically collecting objects which are lying around on the surface. And so they're finding all of this sort of stuff fairly densely within this area. Um, and the other reason for that is probably because you've got a major pottery production site underneath this area. Now, there's been minimal intensive excavation of this part of the valley. The site of Brack Mills is here. That was a fairly large excavation, and it did find three pottery kilns. There's also a potential kiln up at Little Houghton, right in the valley bottom. So I think probably what we've got here is that evidence for a nucleation of pottery production in some sort of fashion. Quite what that is, we don't know. But again, looking at the map, you've got major settlements, small towns at Duston and Irchester, but this area is the area in between. So again, it's anchored within that rural settlement pattern rather than being oriented towards anything else. I would also note at this point the lack of military settlement in Northamptonshire. So again, a lot of those kind of older arguments hinge on the idea that um, ceramic production and indeed wider developments in the consumption of material culture in the early parts of Roman Britain were anchored to the fact that you had effectively, the best part of 50,000 troops arriving with the Roman army in AD 43. Um, there's no evidence that those troops stayed in Northamptonshire for very long at all. There aren't really any forts in this part of the world, at least not confirmed ones. There's suggestions of them in various places, but nothing convincing to my mind. So that argument that any of these clusters of kilns are kind of orienting towards military production is kind of falling on stony ground just on that basis, really. So again, not really any evidence for them accreting to any particular settlement type other than farmsteads. So the aggregate for that is that I think we're probably looking at a situation where the Upper Nene Valley potters were predominantly agriculturalists. They're predominantly farmers who potentially didn't even specialize in pottery production, may not have considered themselves to be potters at all. They were probably farmers who made ceramics as a sideline in in an effort to potentially make things that were catering to containers to creating containers to move their produce around or to create objects that their families and neighboring families could use for their everyday subsistence needs. Um, a far cry from the kind of commercialized model of ceramic production and consumption, which a lot of people will sell you for the Roman period. So I think that's really interesting. Um, Another question, which I think is something which we don't really have a grasp on, which I think is really important actually, and something that we can really comment upon in detail, is how potters interacted with each other. So we're kind of comfortable with this idea that um, kiln sites and pottery making sites clustered in the landscape. But I think there's quite a significant implication to that. It sort of implies that a lot of potters will have known each other and that skills will have moved between different groups of people. Now, you can see this quite clearly, most clearly in this region, through the distribution of what is called Upper Nene Valley greyware. No prizes for guessing why we call it that. It's made in the Upper Nene Valley and it's grey. That's kind of it. Um, Despite the kind of the fact that it's fairly common, it's also quite distinctive. It's this kind of bluish grey color, which is not, kind of really normal compared to a lot of the grey wares that you get in neighboring regions. And so the knowledge of the clays that will have produced that effect may have been a kind of a piece of knowledge which people will have shared between themselves. Oh, the clay over that way, if you go into that cutting, will fire to this kind of bluish grey that we expect, and that the people who are going to be using this material expect. Whereas if you use the stuff over there, it won't quite have the same effect. So there's a kind of embedded knowledge there. As well as that, returning to the X-ray that I showed you guys earlier, a lot of this stuff is wheel thrown. Now, wheel throwing is only really starting to properly get going in the Roman period, around the time that Nene Valley Greyware begins to be made. It starts off around AD 70 and goes all the way through into the 3rd century AD. But before this, you had a range of wares which kind of played around with the potter's wheel. There were sometimes wheel thrown, but were also equally commonly hand built and then just kind of finished on the wheel. Whereas with the grey wares, we really start to see wheel throwing becoming an embedded technology. And that's interesting from this point of view of kind of interaction because wheel throwing, I don't know if anybody's um, got any experience making pottery, but wheel throwing is really hard when you first get going at it. I did a course a few years ago, and it really takes a long time, a lot of practice to get good at it. And so, what we're talking about there is the need for kind of extended periods of learning. You're talking about apprenticeships, potentially relationships of master and apprentice between different people, and the development effectively of complex motor skills, which you can't just pick up from casual exposure. So what we're talking about there is the development of a body of knowledge which is encapsulated in this ware, which you couldn't just achieve by copying something that you've seen on a market stall, for instance. You had to have learned it from someone who's either developed those skills themselves or acquired them from elsewhere. Um, Now, it's interesting looking again at the distribution of kiln sites that were making this greyware. We've got five of them confirmed within the region. I won't name them all, but basically, they're distributed over a fairly broad swathe of the area. Most of them kind of hugging the valley down here between the modern towns of Northampton and Wellingborough, but also up here between Brixworth and Scaldwell, the modern villages there. So it's a fairly expansive region, and it kind of begs the question, right? Well, these clearly aren't neighbours. They're not people who you might have just kind of come across when you're walking down the road one day. But potentially there's a community here and a group of people who are kind of knitted to one another in various different social ways um, through things like intermarriage. Um, that may have provided a social fabric through which those skills moved. For instance, if one partner in a marriage moved from one place to another, they'll take those skills with them, set up elsewhere. You kind of end up with this pattern across the landscape. Equally, there could have been a trade in skills. Will you take my son or daughter, for instance, on as an apprentice? Yes, they'll have to move away for a few years to learn all of these skills and become really good at what they want to do. But is that something that's developing in this period when the skills required to produce pottery are becoming that kind of niche? Um, Equally, are these people chasing these economic opportunities that are potentially developing in the Roman period? Maybe with the rise of certain nuclear settlements, you've got the kind of the need for more specialized potters who are creating objects, if not to kind of follow those urban or sort of semi-urban markets, who are simply learning to make lots of ceramics of a certain type in order to supply a community of people, most of whom don't make their own pottery anymore. Again, there's a complete possibility, but I think what that all kind of amalgamates into is what we might call a community of practice. So this is kind of rare evidence for a a group of people who demonstrably interacted with each other in the landscape. Um, so again, we're kind of getting to grips with the social lives of these people, which I think is really interesting. And I think potentially the most interesting feature of it is the fact that it's so localized. So what we've got here is a slightly zoomed out um, image of the landscape here. So the area that we're talking about, the kind of Northampton Wellingborough region is here, the Upper Nene Valley region. Contemporaneously with the Upper Nene Valley industry in that kind of first to second century period, you've also got the development of three other major regional producers, some in the Lower Ouse Valley in Cambridgeshire, in the Horningsea Valley, the Horningsea industry in the Cam Valley just near Cambridge, and around Peterborough, the development of the Lower Nene Valley industry. Now, the interesting thing with that is that despite that impression of kind of enclaves of potters and people who are interacting within themselves, the dating evidence, which is really good for this period actually, suggests that these three industries, the Upper Nene, Lower Ouse, and Horningsea industries, were all getting going probably within one, maybe 2 decades of one another. Now, archaeologically speaking, that is a blink of an eye. And it's really remarkable actually how good the evidence for this is. It comes both in the form of vessel typology and in the form of radiocarbon dating. But what it means is that not only are these kind of potters existing within these enclaves with these kind of blank spaces in between, ideas are occasionally transmitting between them. So you get the rise of the production of different types of greyware in these different areas in probably the same generation of craftspeople. Um, but they're each doing it slightly differently, such that now, as archaeologists, we can pick out Upper Nene Valley greyware versus Horningsea greyware, for instance. which means that they're all working slightly differently. Um, the implication is probably fairly straightforward. This is a fairly big swathe of the landscape. So I think probably what you're seeing here is twofold. You're seeing people who are tied to major river valleys. So each of these areas has a major river valley within it. And that landscape feature probably helped to provide the raw materials which are necessary for pottery making. You need a lot of water as well as fuel and clay to make pottery, particularly when you're doing it on the wheel. But as well as that, you're probably looking at groups of people who just kind of knew each other. Um, I've recently presented the argument that, within these districts, you're probably talking about, at the very, very most, a day's walk between a settlement at one end of the district and another. Probably quite substantially smaller than that in some cases, for instance, the Lower Valley, where it's smaller. Whereas there would have been greater than a day to get between the two. And that suggests that despite the rise of the Roman road system and all that sort of stuff, people's experiences and their kind of social networks remained predominantly localized. Um, I think that's a really fundamental and really important observation that we can make on this basis, actually, because, we kind of have normally fallen back on this idea that the Roman road system just kind of connected people. It just allowed this explosion of ideas, and it did. But the evidence actually from this kind of quite intimate scale is that people still had that local community. People still maintained those social networks which had served them for generations, probably for centuries beforehand. And that was a complete, major factor in the way they experienced the world. But ideas were flowing freely between those enclaves. Moving on to a slightly different tack. This is Rushton fineware, which is, to put it simply, some of the most bizarre pottery that was made in Roman Britain. Um, it's bizarre because not only is it kind of really unusual, the colors here are so heavily sort of mottled and what we call fire clouded, which is really not normal for a lot of pottery. It's also really distinctive because it's so heavily decorated with these painted designs. These kind of darker stippled areas in these illustrations show red painted motifs which are present on a lot of these objects. Further to that, the vessel shapes are really weird. You might have to take my word for it, but these are very non-standard vessel forms for this period, particularly this thing. I'd be really interested if any of you guys have got any ideas about what this might be for. Um, we kind of locally just call them tubes, but they're clearly not just tubes. They've got a base within them. The best thing I can think of is if everybody's seen those kind of gin measures where you've got a big cup and a little cup kind of attached to one another, but top to bottom. Um, they kind of look like a big version of that to me, but they're like this tall. Um, so I wouldn't like to see the amount of gin that anybody was drinking out of one of those. I digress. The the significance of Rushton fineware is really quite significant. When it was first excavated and discovered in the 1970s, the excavators called the potters who were working at Rushton the intrusive group, which is something that I really hate nowadays, and I've been trying everything that I can to not have to bring that term back, because I think it's yeah, it's just not great, particularly in the current political climate. Um, but it kind of speaks to the weirdness of this stuff. The idea being that these were foreign ideas that were coming probably from somewhere in continental Europe and implanting themselves within Britain. So it fed really nicely into those narratives of people following in the wake of the Roman army. Um, but it kind of falls down as a model on the basis that, well, as I've mentioned, there's no evidence of good Roman military activity in Northamptonshire. And secondly, if they're coming from somewhere with these ideas and these styles, we've never been able to trace back where those things were from. So that idea of it being kind of a migratory um, aspect doesn't really hold water when you look at the arguments that closely, in my mind. But I think what Rushton Fineway does show is evidence of creativity. And again, this is something that we as archaeologists are not that accustomed to thinking about, at least not in the kind of modern sense. Although we're starting to get better at it. Now, what I want to look at in that sense is a fairly humble vessel from the Rushton kiln site, which is this one I've pictured here in the photograph. You can see the illustration of it shows it's quite a dumpy little thing. It's a little cup. You can see that's it's a 10p piece. You might not know how big that is, but basically you've got a little kind of cup, probably about the size of the one I've got here. So it's a small little vessel. Um, and it's stylistically really odd because it's got this kind of zigzag decoration on it. The rim is a very specific sort of shape that harkens back to much bigger drinking vessels. These are what we call butt beakers, and they're very, very common both at Rushton and in the wider early Roman repertoire. But this is kind of a squat version of it. So the way I think of this vessel being a kind of unique oddity, there's no other vessels like this recovered really anywhere that I know of, is that someone maybe has come along and sort of said, "Can you make me a set of cups?" And the Russian potters have kind of said, "Oh, we don't really make cups, but we make beakers. So maybe I can make you like a small version of those." And so they've kind of used the idea that they've got for vessels that they do know how to make and just kind of tweaked that in a way, which is effectively the essence of creativity. And I think to go back to the kind of more elaborate vessels that are unparalleled here, I think that probably speaks a bit more holistically of what the Rushton potters are doing. We're not, again, accustomed to really thinking of Roman pottery um, as pieces of art. But I think it may be beneficial to think of that in this case. These are objects that potentially show experimentation and people messing around with new ideas, as all of those kind of new ideas are flowing around in the context of kind of Britain entering the Roman world, as it were. So yeah, another question I want to kind of use to sort of draw us to a close is why the Upper Nene Valley. So I've made the point that this is kind of a focal point in terms of the distribution of pottery production sites in Roman Britain. But why here? And particularly why here in the early Roman period? A lot of the industries, the major nucleated industries, that we know of in Roman Britain, are actually of late Roman date, so they're third and fourth century, whereas ours is first and second. So why here and why so early? Well, the first thing is obviously that the Nene Valley is a major landscape feature. It cuts the river itself cuts through several beds of good potting clay, so it exposes those beds and makes them easily accessible. It's also an area um, where those skills could have become embedded, and where those skills were probably integrated quite conveniently within the wider agricultural settlement pattern as we've seen. So that leads us to think, right, well, how did that economy work? How did people actually interact with each other in an economic sense? And how was the ceramic industry bound up with that? So the period that we're talking about, as you might imagine, is a period of kind of economic boom. Um, with the annexation of Britain into the Roman Empire, you get effectively a process of intensification, particularly in terms of agriculture. You get changes, or yeah, increasingly intensive cultivation of certain crops and certain animals, um, and this results in the development of significant agricultural surpluses. Probably a lot of that stuff is being siphoned off things like taxes. It's been sent off to supply the military, to kind of keep them supplied and to stop the Romans' state treasury from having to cough up too much of the cash for that kind of very expensive military occupation. And so this whole kind of process of intensification seems to have been part of an extractive Roman state. Now, perhaps pottery was a part of that. So I've already mentioned this was a material culture type very heavily embedded in the rural economy, which was the part of the economy which was really, really, really intensively exploited. So potentially pottery was being used as packaging, and we get these kind of big coarse jars. They're called lid-seated jars because you can't quite see here, but they've got a little kink in the rim, which was designed to take a lid. And so you can imagine that they would have been filled up with, grains or various produce of whatever type and used to ship the material across the province to wherever it needed to be. It's one hypothesis, I think it's probably quite a nice one, but there's no way of proving that that's the case, unfortunately. Um, Alternatively, I think a similarly appealing hypothesis is that there was a demand for more pottery to be used by a workforce or a community who were not making it for themselves because they were too busy being involved in those kind of processes of agricultural extensification. If indeed they weren't moving to towns to cater to the needs of those settlements themselves. Um, so I think there's a lot more work to be done, particularly on how the ceramic industry might have been integrated and kind of closely knitted into that wider economy. But um, I think it's probably quite a grassroots sort of experience of the way that Roman imperialism worked. Actually, what would have been the implications of the Roman annexation of Britain for your average farmer? They might have paid their taxes to someone slightly different, and they might have had to augment the way that they were doing things to make more of a given object. And I think that's maybe the sort of thing that we're thinking about here. And so it's kind of an experiential aspect of the way that we think about that, which I think is really important. Final argument that I want to present here, well, not so much an argument, but an observation, is the prospect that actually some of the Upper Nene Valley potters may not actually have been, skilled individuals who were acquiring those skills for their own gain. They might have been effectively indentured, they might have been slaves. The prospect of this has been sort of we've been caused to sort of reconsider this idea recently because of the excavation of a skeleton at Great Casterton, which is in Rutland, just outside Northamptonshire to the north, which had this set of iron fetters found around its ankles. Now, there's all sorts of different implications to why that might have been. They might have been a prisoner, they might have been an outcast, but equal possibility is that they might have been a slave. Now, that we know that slavery was a common feature of life in the Roman world. It's talked about a lot in the historical sources, and we know that an awful lot of slave trading happened in the Mediterranean world. But we don't often tend to think about it in the sort of northern provinces and in Britain because we haven't got that wealth of historical evidence that kind of really allows us to get into it. But we do know that slaves were a major feature of the Roman economy. And therefore, we might want to start thinking again about the notion of slaves being a major feature of the Romano-British economy. It's well known that in the Mediterranean, for instance, um, farms had widespread use of slaves, such that authors such as Columella comment at length on the fact that you don't want to leave your farm in the custody of a slave. You want to leave them in the custody of a freed person or a citizen who was managing farm slaves. The implication being that farm slaves were very, very common on a lot of farms. Um, could the same have been true of craftspeople, including potters? I think there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't have been. Um, we also know from things like Diocletian's price edict that a skilled slave, a slave who had a craft, was worth more in monetary terms than a slave who was unskilled. So upskilling potters in such a way that you might end up with a distribution like this is a complete possibility in terms of, is this one of the reasons that we find such a distribution um, of skills, of the knowledge to produce a very specific type of ceramic? Is it because actually these people weren't moving because of their own free will? They weren't moving because they were marrying someone nearby. They weren't moving because they were chasing a particular economic opportunity. They were moving because they'd been sold. Um, I think there's also a very appealing argument in that. Again, it's not something that we can directly prove, unfortunately, but it is something that's worth thinking about and which I think really helps to sort of color our picture of life in rural Roman Britain, you know. It adds texture to those impressions, and I think also potentially allows us to start thinking, are these people actually people who've got a really important story that's really relevant in the modern world, but which we've never really cottoned on to. Um, yeah, I think it's kind of really profound and really important actually that we throw light on that sort of thing, or at least the possibility that these people may have had experiences which were not particularly pleasant, but um, which were very different to our own. It also follows that if you've got slave trading, that you might have arrangements between the various different craftworking districts, and that's how skills were transferred between those areas. Yeah, as I say, it's kind of a dark way of thinking about it potentially, but nevertheless, it's probably the reality of the situation. Um, so yeah, something to think about there. Um, yeah, I think I will leave it there. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and I hope that was interesting.
It was. Thanks, Doc. What I want to do is see if there are questions. I'm going to try to
I'm
do
going
this.
to try to do this.
I'm going to try to do
I'm going to
this
try to do this
without an echo.
without an echo.
I'll turn
I'll
my
turn my,
I'll turn my
Yeah, I
microphone.
might
yeah, I might
see if it's on your
see if
end.
it's on your end.
Um,
Um,
we'll try it that way.
I'll try it
Don't know
that
if you
way.
can hear me now.
I don't know if you can hear me now.
And see if there are questions.
And
If
see
there's
if there's
questions,
questions. If there's questions,
just raise your
just
hand.
raise your hand.
Hi, Bruce, go ahead.
Bruce, go ahead.
I was wondering if there's any identifiable residue found in particularly in the fineware, that might indicate their use.
So we
So
do find
we do
residues
find
in some of these ceramics, not so much in the fine wares, because the residues that we tend to find are cooking residues. So obviously the fine wares don't really have that. So the cook pots mainly that have them on. As to what those residues are, we don't really know because we've not had the sort of organic residue analysis conducted on those finds to date. But it is something that I've got my eye on doing at some point in the future because yeah, it's kind of the missing link, I think. We know the production so fairly well, but not the consumption. So no, it's a good question.
That's a good question.
The second question is, how far afield has this distinct pottery been found? Is it traveling only locally, or did it get quite far afield?
So predominantly locally is the answer to that question. So there are issues with recognition of it non-locally, which is something that I'm trying to tackle at the moment by sort of liaising with colleagues. But the essence of it seems to be that the Nene Valley pottery sort of stays within the Upper Nene region. You get bits of it in neighbouring areas. You get some of it going up to Leicester, for instance. And you get bits of it appearing in sort of the counties to the south, but not really much beyond that and not in big amounts. So it seems to be predominantly being consumed by members of the local community.
Thank you.
There are a couple chat questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to grab those. Um, from Murray, you mentioned wood as a fuel. Is there any evidence, or do you have any suspicion of what kind of wood was used?
So yeah, there's analysis being done of charcoal from a couple of these sites, and it seems to be quite varied. It seems that for the most part, from memory, it's been a while since I read these reports. From memory, we've got evidence mostly that it's coppiced wood, so sort of small wood, not kind of big logs and bits of kind of oak and that sort of. Although there is oak found, but it seems that they're predominantly using small wood that um, is going to generate those kind of high temperatures fairly rapidly. But yeah, it's the evidence is quite variable though because it's quite localized. So effectively, I think they're probably just using what they had nearby. Um, yeah, what we really need is more analysis of that type to kind of develop an idea of pattern rather than just kind of a at this site they were doing this, and that's interesting. I think we need a kind of holistic view of that. So yeah.
Good question. And I think a lot of us see England presently and revert it backwards. And forced is an interesting question there. Another question from Dr. McDonald was, do we know the haplogroups of the Romans? They found a lot of es and as's in the ashes of Mount Vesuvius.
Um, yeah, so we don't know too much about any of that stuff really in terms of Roman Britain, I'm afraid. Um, no, so in terms of the genetic makeup of Roman Britain, we don't really understand that much about it at the moment, although there are active projects looking at that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a kind of watch this space question at the moment. Although um, we know that there were various people from overseas present in Roman Britain. We've got evidence from the epigraphy of, I can't remember her name, but there's a famous
The lady,
example of, yeah, I don't know if you can remember her name, Rod, um, who came from, I think, somewhere in the Mediterranean. So
yeah,
we've got good
Palmyra.
evidence of that. Sorry?
I think she's from the area of Palmyra.
Yes,
Um,
you're right. Yes, I just wish we could remember her name.
and her first name starts with, I think, with an S. I can see her statue. It was at the Legion's exhibit in the
Right.
museum.
Yeah. So
Okay.
she's a good example. We've also got evidence of a someone from North Africa found in York, I believe, which is some of the most interesting evidence that we've got of population movement. So yeah, but at the moment we're kind of looking at that keyhole evidence, so we don't really understand too much about it. We need that genetic evidence on a bigger group, on a bigger scale, to sort of have a look at that in a bit more detail. So yeah.
And I think in Earchester, because there is a cemetery there that's being excavated, the cost of some of that work is not super high, but it is sometimes higher than the ability that entities have. So I
Yeah.
was kind of taken by surprise with that and making some inquiries to Ben. There is another question that might be further in your wheelhouse. Where in Britain is the best potting clay?
Well, that depends on what you mean by best. I could go into depth on this, but I think that probably would be excessive, and you guys would be bored to tears by that. But it really varies. I mean, adequate potting clay is found across much of southern Britain. The geology here is predominantly sedimentary, and there's a lot of kind of glacial deposits, which mean that you've got a lot of things that have kind of been kicked up. Um, by the kind of movement of glaciers, and the clays underlying that tend to be quite good for potting. You've got things like the Oxford clay, down in Dorset. You've got I can't remember which type of clay it is they're using, but there's a whole different load of variety. It really just depends on what you're trying to use it for. I think that's kind of the more intriguing question. Are you looking for something that's kind of rough and ready and you can make coarser out of it, or are you looking for something very specific where you can make fine ware out of it? Um, but by and large, it doesn't seem to be a problem sort of in the southern parts of Britain anyway to find good potting clay, within a few kilometers of where you are.
And then Catherine Brown has her hand up. Thanks to Dave Jessica for helping me there.
Uh, Thank you. I was just one, apologies if you've answered this, I'd had to miss part of the talk. With the potteries being concentrated in the rural areas, has the consideration that this might have been a deliberate decision because of the risk of fire? Because I not don't know more about the medieval period than the Roman period, but I know that certainly during the medieval period, industries that were using a lot of fire were quite often either concentrated in one area or actively disencouraged from being inside the city walls because of the risk that a stray spark and half the city goes burnt
Yeah,
down.
yeah. I
Now,
think
I know the Romans are a bit different, but I was just curious if this has been considered as a potential explanation.
yeah. I think it's definitely one sort of practical reason as to why that might be the case. Um, yeah, as to whether there was a kind of embargo on it, I'm not sure, because you do get So in places like London, for instance, and Colchester, you find pottery kilns within the urban fabric. So whether the Romans were kind of unduly cautious about the risk of fire is kind of a little bit up in the air. But I think it's definitely one consideration. I mean, just on a practical sense, when you've got lots of kind of unused rural land around you, why would you set up something that's going to create lots of smoke and fumes and create lots of risk when you're just building a new settlement, right? Um, but I think to my mind, to my mind, there's a lot more to it than that. I think that it's probably more to do with the fact that the people who are making these ceramics, that's just kind of where they live. That's the land that they owned or rented or, have the land tenure system work. That's the land they had access to. So that's my mind. But, other people might disagree with that.
And then there's another question. And
Thank you.
Maria, thank you for asking this because I think I've wanted to ask this repeatedly. Was the Nen River navigable during the Roman period? And if so, I'll add, how far up?
Yeah, so the straight answer to that is that we don't think it was. So based on obviously, knowing this is slightly tenuous, but based on the fact that it wasn't during the medieval period, we think that it probably wasn't in the Roman period either. Um, so in terms of the Nen being used as a kind of transport route, I don't think there's loads of mileage in that argument, and that's sort of backed up by the fact that there is evidence for a road leading alongside the River Nen, which kind of goes to suggest, well, that they couldn't use the river, so they had to
Right.
construct a road to kind of be used in lieu of that. So no, it wasn't.
Okay. Very cool. Are there any final questions? Otherwise, we are going to um, close out. And Doc, thank you. I really appreciate it.
More than
I
welcome.
know others here did as well. And I appreciate the turnout for everyone. Thank you for that. And have a great Saturday, Doc. A round of applause from everybody watching.